people online. My name is Thomas Vogrup. I'm the head of the GPA coordination unit. I will explain in a minute what the GPA stands for. Thank you also to our host, to our kind host, to SE4All, Sustainable Energy for All, for the great pavilion here in the COP26 Centre in Glasgow. What we want to talk to you about today is, as you can see on the screen, goodbye to dirty diesel. So we would like to talk to you about the diesel-powered infrastructure, fossil fuel-powered infrastructure in humanitarian settings, and I'll also explain this in a minute. I'm here on behalf of the GPA, but the GPA is a platform capturing many different organizations from the humanitarian space as well as from development and energy. And next slide, please. We have a slightly technical issue today because I don't have the clicker, so if you see delays, then bear with us in a minute. So what we're going to do is I will present to you the topic a little bit in the first 10 minutes. Then we have a great panel discussion with one person here, Cecilia Ragazzi, and two people online, which I will introduce in a minute. And then we have some closing remarks. And also to the audience in the room, feel free to ask questions, prepare questions. I'm happy to take one at the end. Well, one or two. As the other speakers for the panel discussion, we have Andrew Harper, who is the Special Advisor for Climate Action within UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Organizations. So a very key partner, very knowledgeable about not only the energy infrastructure, but also the broader topic of climate vulnerability of displaced people. And then we have Mats Hansen, who is the CEO of Cube Energy, a Norwegian company who is actually offering energy solutions in these settings which we are talking about today. Next slide, please. Go on. Exactly, this is the GPA, so just in a nutshell, we are the middle one, the Secretariat. We have a very central global strategy with the steering group, but also with the so-called Clean Energy Challenge. Can you go on? We have the steering group, as I mentioned already, with 18 organizations, key organizations, and we have this Clean Energy Challenge with more than 200 organizations. So please feel to also apply to become a member if you are interested in this topic of energy for displaced for displaced settings or in displacement settings. And when we talk about displacement settings, for us it's about refugees and internally displaced people, but also their host community. So this is really key for us to see this as an entire system. Next one, please. But what we are talking about today is really, you can basically go scroll through the entire slide. So, one back. Exactly. So what we are talking about today is to go from the left picture, the dirty diesel, to the right, to a shiny solar panel, right? This is the issue. And from our survey among energy experts in 6 organizations, we know that the UN and sort of the key UN agencies are currently running 11,400 diesel generators. So it's quite a significant amount of generators, and we know this is rather the lower end of the spectrum because we got only reported those generators who are actually owned by the organizations, not, for example, rented or leased or whatever. And we estimate that this requires roughly 110 million for diesel each year. And you have to recognize in some areas we actually are flying in the diesel per helicopter because the road is blocked again. So this is really the issue what we're talking about here. So very decentralized situations, no grid whatsoever, and lots of impact also when it comes to CO2 emissions. It's roughly 70,000 return flights from Geneva to Nairobi, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And in this study, we also looked at how much would it actually cost if we would solarize these. And as you can see, the number, it's roughly 236 million, 240 million. If we want to replace something like 70-80% with solar solutions. But it would lead to annual savings of roughly 70 million. So it's quite a good return on investment. Next slide, please.
Not?
Now we are losing it. Can you pull one up? Next slide is about why is it important. Can you? Thank you. First of all, the first one is, we're talking about here at COP, right? We have a moral obligation. The UN, the humanitarian actors, need to be seen as walking the talk, and they need to be seen as the front runners, actually, in solarizing. The second point is also obvious. We need to stop burning money. And that's what we do every day whenever we use these generators. And we see, as you can see also from the previous slides, from the numbers, easily 30-40% savings are possible with replacing solar, but also with with energy efficiency measures. So it is really crucial, and this economic argument will become more and more important in the future. Obviously, we're also talking about environmental performance, and if we do it right, this solarization, then we can also use this as a springboard for private engagement, private sector engagement, and to create a viable energy market, which in an area where nobody would invest otherwise, because it is fragile, because it's dangerous, because it is in the middle of nowhere. So this is really one of the other drivers for us. Next slide, please. So what do we see right now? Go on. Sorry, stop. This is the existing model. So the UN, if they have the money, they buy a solar system, and then they use the existing grant funding, and then they maintain it, and that comes with various issues. For example, even if the electricity comes for free, you have to make sure you can replace parts. You have to replace the batteries sometimes in a couple of years. So and often that is one of the issues here, that the funding over the long term is not available. And also you have to have a decent amount of capacity and expertise on the ground to run a solar system, even though it is easy, but it is something that is not there everywhere. Next, go on, please. And what we are suggesting as a new model is energy as a service. And for those who are working in energy, is nothing new at all. It is really common sense in many other places. And what we've developed is basically a legal framework to replace the existing diesel-powered infrastructure with a leasing or a power purchase agreement model. That's what it's already in place. We have this legal framework, and the idea is really to bring a private sector in, a private company in. They would buy the assets, they would operate the assets, and they would just sell electricity as they would do with anybody else. And the UN, they don't have to bother about the maintenance and everything anymore. They just need to buy the electricity as they would do now for the diesel. Go on. However, there are some challenges, obviously, like with everything. There's very little experience in this, and we can talk about this with our speakers in a minute. We also see UN, or the humanitarian system, and the private sector, they don't speak the same language, even if it's English. It is a very different risk profile, it's a very different approach of everything. So that's why we've developed it's basically a catalogue of legal clauses that can be used by the UN and private sector to develop a contract in these settings. And the other point, and this is the sort of the remaining and the remaining thing, in every contract the UN needs to have a termination clause, which says, in the case of an emergency, in the case of political instability, whatever, we need to terminate this contract within 3 months. If you are a private company and just invested $500,000 into a new solar system, that's going to be difficult for you to justify this and to get this cleared by your legal people and get funding for that, get a loan for that. That's why we are working now on basically an insurance package to de-risk this investment. Hopefully we will have this ready by beginning of next year. And once this is ready, we can basically roll this out on a global scale. And click one more, please. Under humanitarianenergy.com, you can find all this information. You can find the legal framework. You can find also the model for this termination clause. So everything is in place now. It's really on us to finalize this. Continue, please. Okay, before we go on with the panel discussion, any questions from the audience? Yeah, there's one. And you've got a mic.
Thank you. From the perspective of a company that is willing to invest into PPA, how can they access the pool of opportunities from UN to know these projects? Or
Okay. First of all, as I mentioned, the information which I just presented, everything is public source. It's on our website and also on Energypedia. So feel free to access this to get the first ideas about this topic in general. And then the issue with the UN is we are talking about the United Nations, but in fact we are talking about, in our space, 20, 30 different organizations. And they all have their own standalone procurement systems and structures in place, right? So if you are a company interested in this space, you have to register on the so-called UN Global Marketplace, which is the basic the procurement platform of the United Nations. And from time to time, you will find these tenders. For example, UNHCR issued such a tender beginning of this year. UNICEF are doing this, WFP are doing this. So regularly you see these offers coming up. And or many of these organizations are currently working on this, the same as many NGO partners. Okay, any other questions? Not the case, then I would be happy to. Oh, René.
Thank you. I was wondering, for these private partners, would you also be interested in working with local organizations that might be able to do this? I can imagine that can be difficult in a lot of locations. But
can we park this question for the Q&A, because this is really what Cecilia actually can talk about. Okay, good. Then let's dial in our speakers. Do we see them? Can we see them? Perfect. So just a second. Maybe Cecilia, we start with you, and we start with the last question. Here's Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Good to see you.
Thanks for the introduction.
Is Mats coming on as well? Okay, next one. Okay, maybe it's still Cecilia. Can we start with this question from René? How would you, as an NGO, be able to support these efforts in the field?
Yeah, so just before answering to your question, just a quick introduction. So Thomas was really talking about UN bodies mainly. I work for Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is one of the leading INGOs, so probably more hands-on, but still we share many of the challenges of the UN world, also on the implementation side. So in terms of the main challenges probably that we see right now, if I have really to try to summarize, I would identify three main buckets. And at Mercy Corps, we are really used to work in a market system development thinking. So for me, I really like on the supply side, on the demand side, on the ecosystem side. So on the demand side, I would say that I can really share a personal experience. We are now in the process of tracking our own emissions at Mercy Corps, and we are doing that against a baseline we developed for 2019. So pre-COVID, it wouldn't make much sense really to look at the past year. And really, like, while we were doing this exercise, we realized that our own tracking systems is absolutely inadequate to track our own emissions, not only because we can't really allocate, for instance, the diesel that we consume to which use of the diesel we're making. Is that for fuel? Is that to fuel for cars? Is that for generators, for instance? But also we don't have a very detailed cost analysis. And of course, money really do speak. So also having a very clear economic breakdown would also allow us to make a new case. So we thought that we needed really to change our tracking system first, and we did so. Now we have a very solid methodology that allows us to track our emissions, but also we needed to educate ourselves. Really what Thomas just said, looking around and trying to discover the new technologies that are available, but also the financing models that are available. Our business is usually is exactly what you just explained. We would purchase generators, we would purchase diesel, and we would just run our operations like that. But clearly this is very expensive, is inefficient, and it's very polluting. So that is really on the demand side. On the offer side, we see probably a lack of a qualified energy provider and suppliers, with some exceptions, of course, on the line as well, that are actually able to work in some of the locations where we do work. The places where we work are really like the toughest places, just like a conflict afflicted after natural disasters. It's very hard for a private sector actor to come in and invest money and to try really to make the financial model work. So on the supply side, we see definitely an issue there. And then there's the ecosystem. The donor community usually really looks at procurement and policies that do not foresee long-term investments. Of course, they want their money to be accounted for, and leasing systems or PPA normally would take a longer stretch of time. So we really see also this ecosystem as probably one of the main obstacles. Yeah.
Thank you. And I really liked your first point. When we talk about innovation, it's actually not about technology, right? It's really about the business model as such. How the technology is there. We see solar systems in place since many years. We also know that there are many companies, for example, offering solar container solutions. So the technology is really not the issue here. It's really about the business model. So that's important when you talk about innovation. Andrew, over to you. First of all, good to have you on the call. It's great to have Andrew Harper. As I mentioned, he's the special envoy for climate change at UNHCR. But not only that, because he was the director for the operations for UNHCR, and also many years in the field. Andrew, first of all, maybe tell our audience a little bit. Why do we need the diesel? What do you power with that? And what are the plans from UNHCR to decarbonize that? Because that's your business now.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Thomas. I think if we sort of see the failure of much of the world in terms of doing the right things, and even developed countries, about how slow, even in the UK or Australia or other developed countries, it is to decarbonise and to move to renewable energy. And then you look at where we are working, which is very much in conflict or post-conflict areas, or very much on the borders in marginal areas. You can grasp sort of the challenges that we've got. I've just come back from the border with Mali and Mauritania, where we've got a camp of 60,000 people, and you just don't have the facilities there in order to change from diesel to renewable energy. But while that is a challenge, that is also a massive opportunity, as you quite well know, Thomas. There is huge opportunities for the private sector to support this transition. And why is it so important for us? Because UNHCR, because we are on the front lines of the climate emergency, we are on the front lines of conflict, we see every day the impact of environmental degradation, of the impact of climate change. And we know that not only do we need to support the adaptation of communities, we also need to mitigate our own footprint. And our footprint is quite huge. We're a UN agency. We've got something like 7,000 vehicles operating in quite tough locations. We've got 3,000. You mentioned there's 11,000 generators. We've got 3,000 of those generators. We've got hundreds of water pumps that are reliant on diesel generators. So this is a huge like cost to the environment, but also cost, as you quite rightly say, in terms of money. But it's also a huge opportunity for us to transition. And so there's no reason why we should be moving diesel hundreds of kilometres. And again, where we're operating in on the border with Mali, it takes about 3 or 4 days to drive to some of these locations, moving diesel from the coast to the border areas. When you've got the Sahel, you've got so much sun. Like, why don't we have this transition? So what we're doing is we're already making those assessments. We've got something like 530 offices around the world. The first step which we're looking to do is to see how much energy each one of those offices is already using. So we've got green meters, and that's measuring the usage of the energy, and so that we can already start building the business case, which we can then present as part of the request for tenders in order to transition. But if you look at UNHCR with such a huge footprint in these areas, and then if you combine it with friends such as Mercy Corps or IOM or WFP or UNICEF, and we start working in a much smarter, more collaborative manner, you'll be able to set up solar fields which will be able to provide that support to UN agencies and humanitarian agencies. But what we should also be doing is providing support to the host communities and to the host authorities. So the business opportunities is not just reducing the impact of UNHCR and other agencies, but it's also one of empowerment. How do we provide more energy at a lower environmental footprint than what we're currently doing? So how do we empower and provide a much more dignified solution and opportunities for everyone who's responding in such a generous manner to the refugees? So there's some of the key elements. We are not a small operation, but we're desperate to make changes. And if there's one issue which I'd like to get out in COP this year, it's basically the challenge the private sector as much as anyone else. There are solutions out there. We are, as Thomas mentioned, trying to de-risk some of those constraints that the private sector have put forward. So challenge us. Come forward and say, okay, we want to work with you. Then we'll be looking to see how we can mitigate those risks in the countries, because there is a net benefit here. There's a net benefit for the UN. There's net benefit for the populations who are being displaced. There's net benefit for the private sector. And importantly, there's a net benefit for the communities that are providing the protection for the refugees. So we don't want to just say we need to reduce the level of carbon exposure. But we are working in difficult areas. There's unfortunately going to be times, there's going to be a lot of times because there's no alternative, but there's also huge opportunities for us to transition. And I must say that, for instance, SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, also the German BMZ have provided us with seed funding in which they're encouraging us to de-risk this transition towards solar energy. So that's just it in a nutshell. Over.
Thanks, Andrew. And indeed, one of the... Is the mic? Yeah, now it's working, I think. Indeed, one of the things you mentioned is bundling. Andrew said 550 officers, and we have similar numbers from other agencies. If you compare this with the 11,000 generators, we see is actually relatively small-scale solutions we are talking about here. So relatively small-scale generators, which makes it hard to come up with a business model. That's why we need this de-risking facility, and that's why also we need to bundle this. And for example, from the GPA side, we are trying this now out in the first country, Nigeria. We partner with 6 UN agencies. We have identified that, for example, in the north of Nigeria, there are many operations. They're all there, all the humanitarian partners with different locations, but it is possible to bundle these projects, or we are trying now to bundle these projects in the country in north of Nigeria. And Andrew was also talking about business opportunities, and that's a nice segue to Mats. Mats, you are CEO of Cube Energy, and you are working in these places that Cecilia just described. Tell us about this. Tell us about your experience and the challenges you see right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas. I think for perspective, I thought I'd just start out with saying, so we started Cube Energy in 2015. And we were a team of people that had previously worked in the UN, and we wanted to establish a private sector mechanism to see if that could sort of accelerate part of the transition that the UN and other humanitarian agencies were having towards renewables. And at that time, we saw that the technical solutions were absolutely good enough to replace the diesel generators. We saw that the price of equipment had fallen to the degree that there were huge cost savings to be made. And at that point, we thought that more or less all humanitarian operations that were currently on diesel would transition to renewables by 2020, so within 5 years. And as we heard, Thomas, there's still 11,000 generators left, and I understand that less than 3% of humanitarian operations are currently powered by renewables. So there is quite a lot to still be transitioned. I think from our side, I think it's quite interesting to hear about the funding issues that Cecilia mentioned and how that impacts on sort of the potential collaboration between the private sector and the humanitarian organizations. As you pointed out, Thomas, I think for a lot of the potential mechanisms that can unlock a lot of private funding to come in to facilitate this transition, it requires some structural changes in the way that the funding is provided from donors. And we think that the UN and the other humanitarian organizations have a key role to play in starting the sort of, or convincing donors and other funders that they need to provide more long-term financing to allow organizations to get into these different solar as a service arrangement. I think that what Andrew mentioned in terms of really building a data-backed business case that they can present to donors it's a really important first step in doing this. And I think from our perspective, we see too few organizations taking this seriously. And this, in our view, entails really having a systematic overview over what costs that you're currently incurring with running diesel generators, as well as installing simple metering mechanisms to know how much electricity each office is using. So we think that this is having a data-backed business case that is presented to donors is the way of going forward with restructuring these funding mechanisms. And we think that donors, if there are donors in this room, should just, if you receive proposals from organizations where they're asking funding for diesel generators, you should definitely push back if they haven't done any business case analysis on the options of transitioning to renewables. I think that it's really exciting to see this new collaboration between SIDA and UNHCR and setting up the Green Fund. The Green Fund, in essence, will allow UNHCR to go forward with a series of procurements of solar on a service approach and for their offices in East Africa. We think that this is really a huge step in the right direction, and we think that it's definitely a part of generating more experience with how could the rest of the sector also make a similar transition. So we think this is very exciting and look forward to seeing how this will play out in the next year.
Thank you, Mats. Any questions from the audience? Think about it. I have one more to the speakers, then it's your turn. Thank you, Mats. I mean, in terms of, you mentioned too few organizations taking this topic serious. I noted this down. Just for the audience online and for all of the audience in the room, I think in general the UN is taking this serious. There is a United Nations centralized energy action plan, which talks about getting renewable energies up to scale and achieving 80% in 2030. 80% in 2030. If we are taking this down to the 11,000 generators, that means 3 generators per day over the next 9 years, which is a challenge. And we need to start soon if we want to be serious about this. But there is at least the goal, and 80% 2030 and 40% by 25. So take us serious, but also take us by account, hold us accountable for this number. That's quite important as well. Over to targets, and maybe going also to Cecilia and also to Andrew. What are your targets in the organizations? Do you have a plan? Do you have these concrete goals and all of this?
Yes.
Maybe Cecilia first.
Yes, we do. It's actually quite recent. Again, as I said before, we just analyzed our emissions against 2019, and we understood that definitely we needed to take action. The action that we wanted to take and we committed to is to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 with a 25% reduction by 2024. So really we have a clear way ahead of us, and these are really like a means concrete reduction and are not offsetting. So it's really looking at our travel spend, for instance, the fuel spend, but also really where we are purchasing our goods and services. Also those type of emissions will be included into that. So we believe that this target is very ambitious, but we also believe it's achievable. So we have a set of KPIs against which we are monitoring ourselves, and we wanted to hold ourselves accountable also toward our counterparts. So we think that throughout these exercise, not only we are really walking the walk, which is at the core of the action plan itself, but it's also really for Mercy Corps to use our own voice to express how much needed these actions are and how we can actually contribute to this global dialogue over reductions. So there are definitely actions that we are already taking ourselves. For instance, in all our HQs that we have switched toward green energy providers. We have switched also to recycled material within our offices wherever it's possible. And of course, again, I understand that in some locations this is not yet possible, but we are working toward that. We have green teams within our offices, and individually they are really taking small steps that are though very meaningful, and it's really like it speaks loads to how passionate our people are toward this argument. And we have also some of our offices that have switched to solar, and I'm thinking, for instance, about Kenya and Uganda. But again, to my former point, these are probably places where it's easier to convince private sector actors to make the investment toward this type of renewable, because we have the infrastructure there, we have providers there. The real challenge is really to demonstrate that there's a market also in more harder to reach places. We have also very recently merged with an NGO that is very focused on access to energy. It's called Energy for Impact, and thanks to the new acquired expertise that the team bring to Mercy Corps, we really think that we are set on the right trajectory. We really believe that we are on the right track to achieve the plan that we have. So yeah, I think that in terms of our way ahead, this is really like our concrete target.
Thank you. And just to reiterate, Andrew can talk about this much better than I do, but the majority of greenhouse gas emissions are actually from the flights. So, and that is obviously not easy to avoid if you are humanitarian organizations and you actually have to go into these places. You have to be there in the case of emergencies. So this is really one of the biggest challenge. However, also the energy topic in general is something that the user organizations are working on. So it is it is a strong commitment already to come up with these numbers. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Actually, by measuring the energy that our offices use, I can actually say that it's not actually the flights that are the biggest user. 61% of our carbon footprint actually comes from our offices, 23% come from our vehicle fleets, and 16% from travel. So by understanding of where we're using most of the energy allows us then to start addressing where the biggest elements are of our footprint and then seek to reduce it. But as far as targets are concerned, we're seeking to reduce our footprint by 45% by 2030. And that's doable given that 61% of our energy is coming from offices, and there's no reason why we cannot convert the bulk of our energy, the energy that's derived now for our offices from renewables. So I think that's doable. We're also looking to reduce our travel footprint by 15%, so I think that's also doable. And there's within UNHCR we've not only come out with a strategic framework for climate action, but we've also got a vision which includes 3 key green initiatives in order to reduce that footprint. Firstly, as we mentioned, we need to get the data. And so hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have 80% of our offices providing the data through these green energy meters. And that will help us then determine what is the best options and then go out for the business model to see how that could be replaced. I also mentioned we've got a green finance facility to facilitate that change, that transition. It just makes business sense, it makes budgetary sense, it makes every sense in order that we start looking to move from diesel generation to renewables. But that's going to require a bit of an upfront cost. Oh, there's one thing. There was a question which was supposed to be asked, which was, what do we need from donors? What we need from donors is a bit more flexibility, because a lot of the procurement that we undertake, there's still a donor-driven imperative that we go for the lowest cost. The lowest cost is often not the greenest cost, and we're also, as a humanitarian agency, often limited by one-year funding cycles where we've got to disperse it. We need to be looking at a green response and a multi-year way in which we can offset those upfront costs. So that's the ask which I've got in terms of to donors. Green fleets as well. UNHCR wants to be the greenest fleet amongst peer agencies, looking at ride sharing, adding electric vehicle models to the fleet lineup. I've got colleagues around the world in the most desolate locations saying, look, if there's any electric vehicle manufacturers who want to test their vehicles in harsh conditions, we're up for it. So that's another challenge out there. I mentioned reducing our travel-generated CO2 emissions by 15%. That's also very doable. And what's probably also key, and I think the publicity, the profile of COP is supporting this, we also need to change the culture of people involved in humanitarian operations, that they are agents of change. We can do much better than what we have in the past, but we've got to do it in a way which is not siloed by one agency or NGO by one NGO. We need to be seeing how can we collectively work together to reduce our footprint and support the communities in which we're working to reduce their impact as well. So it's very much a win-win situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, looking at the audience, any questions? Can we have the mic, please? Thank you very much. Ladies first, Long Sang.
Hi, I'm Long Sang from the SEER Centre at Loughborough University. One of the main lessons from energy access is the importance of empowering communities in taking part in designing energy solutions. So in the spirit of targets, what are your targets and mechanisms for involving displaced people and host communities in designing these sustainable solutions?
And I guess this is directed to Andrew?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fine.
And maybe Cecilia as well? Yeah?
Okay. No.
Go on first, Andrew.
Go ahead, Andrew.
To make anything sustainable, you need to be engaged with not only the host communities, but make sure that what's the infrastructure that's available in the region in which you're working. So it's no use bringing in anything which is completely alien and which cannot be serviced. So it's imperative that you're working not only with the host community but also the displaced persons in order that they value the assets, the provision, the systems. And it was interesting, it wasn't interesting, it was good to see that in America, where I went to 2 weeks ago, what we were doing there was that we went to a training facility put together by ILO, where they were training refugees in order to repair solar systems. And so training refugees to repair, to establish, to do whatever's going to be required. Same thing was happening in Zartri, where we had a team of, I think, about 50 electricians in order to help set up the system. So everything which you do, if you want to make it sustainable, has to be owned and managed as locally as possible.
Yeah.
Over.
Yeah, thank you. And just to add, we also have a similar project in the pipeline in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp, where we also establish a repair center and recycling center. So that's also something for the future. But Cecilia.
Yeah, no, excellent question. Thanks for that. That really speaks to the type of work. Is it working? Huh?
Yeah.
On the type of work that we are doing. Of course, as a humanitarian agency, we are here to serve the communities we work with, right? And for us, a key principle in doing that is really the principle of cross-subsidization. As an NGO, we are open to keep paying the type of prices that we're paying now for diesel gensets, transferring that to solar systems, having then clean energy access for ourselves, and at the same time opening up the same possibilities to the community we're working with, cross-subsidizing their own tariff. So this model for us, it's really like front and center of what we are trying to do on our access to energy model. And of course, what Andrew was saying in terms of empowering the community also to take care and support providers to maintain this installation is key. But for us, it's really important to see our interventions as an holistic system, not just our own offices, but also for our own interventions. Yeah.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I just got the sign that I need to wrap up. I think, first of all, I want to thank our panelists, Cecilia, Mats, Andrew. Thanks for joining the session today. Thanks for offering your insights. Also, thank you again for our host, Sustainable Energy for All, for setting up this venue. Do we have time for one more question? Yes. Yeah? Okay, one more. Surabi.
Hi.
You talk about it, right?
Hi, I'm Surabhi from Selco Foundation. Thank you so much for that. So I think my question is around something that we work quite a bit on, which is sustainable energy for livelihoods. And when we start to look at host communities as well as internally displaced people and refugees, what are the kinds of pieces of work that each of you feel is most critical to move the needle on that front, and especially around financing mechanisms and availability of technology supply chains? Any thoughts from each of you on that?
Okay, let's make this a 1 minute thing. So what are your key takeaways, the key point you want to change? That's the question, right, Surabi? On this topic. And we start with Mats, because we haven't heard from him.
No, thank you. I think it's a very interesting question. I think from our side, also this goes a bit back to what Cecilia was mentioning earlier. These are difficult to reach locations often, but from a private sector perspective, they're also the places in the world with the highest cost of electricity, often more than $1 per kilowatt hour. So it's areas where, given the right conditions, it's attractive for private sector to invest. I think from our side, looking at the UN and the humanitarian organizations not in isolation, but as part of the community that they're there to serve. For example, investing in solar plants that not only serve and provide electricity to the UN, but also to the host communities, where you make the project bankable by having the UN sign on to a longer agreement, and then you can supply a portion of that electricity to the local population and accept a higher risk on that remaining electricity. I think that could be a good model to sort of ensure that the community is included.
It's heard, exactly. And that's also the model that Cecilia is promoting. Andrew, you have 30 seconds.
When we started this journey about 4 years ago, Thomas, it wasn't even looking at replacing the diesel generators. It was about empowering the 30 or 40 million refugees around the world and displaced persons who did not have access to energy. So I think that's key. Like, it's getting rid of diesel generators is just a byproduct of what we need to be doing, which is empowering communities, providing a dignified future for them by providing renewable energy. That has to be the objective.
Yeah, exactly. And it's today now 1 out of 80 people in the world, right? So we're talking about 80 million to 100 million people now, so it's really significant. Cecilia, you have your final.
Just building on what Andrew just said, of course, like front and center should be the communities, and for me it's not just the plug on the wall, right? That is access to energy, but what do you do with the energy that now you have access to? So productive uses of energy, for instance, improving the living conditions of these families, like this is really like at the key of what I think that we are all here for. So yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So coming back to our opening, goodbye to dirty diesel also means hello to facilities for the people and to a bright future for the people, hopefully. So thank you very much. Thank you for the people online, and thank you again for our participants and speakers. Thank you.
Great work, Thomas. Thanks.